All right, everyone. Hello and welcome back to the lectures for this week. This lecture video, we're going to go over part 6 and 7. So let's go ahead and hop into this one. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the concept of general intelligence. General intelligence, when we're talking about that, and kind of synonymous term still related to that is this term of G factor as general intelligence. So although there's discussions about multiple kinds of intelligence which may exist, humans have this underlying concept of general intelligence, or G. Brains with high or low G would have some general differences in brain architecture or neurochemistry. It's important to note that G is related to brain's language processes. So language ability qualitatively changes the nature of cognitive processing in humans. So there is this advantage in general thinking ability as language ability improves. But also G could be an artifact of culture itself. And I mean, it could be, it truly is, it would have to be. The concept of intelligence itself is, I mean, if we're getting very philosophical with it, it is a societal construct. It's a societal construct because humans have collectively decided that intelligence is this particular thing, and this is what we're saying that it is typically, although it will change a little bit based person to person, and how we would talk about it. But ever since Spearman's general intelligence theory was introduced, there have been many, many other hypotheses on intelligence which have been proposed, all following the idea that distinct forms of intelligence exist and could be dissociable. I'll tell you a little bit more about my thoughts as we get to the end of this lecture, if I remember. So, if we're going to go for an example of genius brain, the way that most of us would consider genius, I suppose, Einstein would be a good example. So Einstein's brain, it was an average size and weight. It had this lateral fissure, which is short on both left and right lateral fissures. They take a particularly striking upward deflection. Investigations imply that cerebral connectivity and high glia to neuron ratio may play important roles in intelligence. So, example would be high glia to neuron ratio in the inferior parietal cortex contributes to mathematical reasoning, whereas certain types of intelligence could be related to differences in cell structure in localized brain regions. Here's an image representing Einstein's brain, and we can see here in these highlighted areas, those lateral fissures of Einstein's brain take this exaggerated upward course relative to its course in typical brains, essentially fusing the posterior temporal regions with the inferior parietal regions. We'll talk about now some divergent and convergent intelligence. So convergent thinking, it's applying knowledge and reasoning skills to narrow the range of possible solutions to a problem, then zeroing in on one correct answer. A form of thinking that searches for a single answer to the question, such as 2 plus 2 equals what? And most of us would answer 4. These types of thinkings are what's measured in traditional intelligence tests, and people with temporal and parietal lobe lesions perform poorly on these types of tests. Divergent thinking, meanwhile, that reaches outward from conventional knowledge and reasoning skills to explore new, more unconventional solutions to problems. It's the form of thinking that searches for multiple solutions to a problem, such as how many ways can a pen be used. People with frontal lobe lesions perform poorly on such tests. Now, intelligence, heredity, epigenetics, and the synapse. So there is this concept of intelligence A. This is Hebb's term for the innate intellectual potential, which is highly heritable and cannot be directly measured. Then Hebb has intelligence B. This is his term for the observed intelligence that's influenced by experience and other factors in the course of development, and it's measured by intelligence tests. Experience may influence intelligence by increasing the number of synapses and the number of glial cells. So one example of this, if we're talking about how experiences could impact what's been your performance on like tests of intelligence, is there are questions on intelligence tests that are asking you just informational type experiences. And if you are somebody who's been able to have a wide variety of experiences, so let's say you've been able to live and navigate inside of the city of Detroit, and you've also been able to work on a farm, and you've also been able to work on a boat, and you've also been able to live internationally. All of those experiences would be able to contribute to the fund of knowledge that you would have available to be able to respond to a wide array of types of questions that could be asked on something like an intelligence test. Whereas somebody who grew up and has lived in one place their entire life, they will have fewer of such experiences to be able to draw upon. And that's no fault of their own. Part of that is, I would say, I mean, you could argue the fault of society at large, or difficulties being able to obtain experiences, which is again no fault of one's own. But the broad range of experiences does influence that to some extent. And so I think it's a really important thing for us to keep into consideration when we're talking about intelligence too, and the ways in which the ways that we measure intelligence can tend to be biased towards the ability to access some of these different experiences. So it would be argued in this theory that appropriate postnatal experiences can enhance development of intelligence B in people with lower than average intelligence A, but a poor or under-resourced environment can hinder the development of intelligence B in people with higher than average intelligence A. A person's genes partly direct synaptic organization, but there's also this epigenetic factor, and there are the variations in experiences coupled with genetic patterns that can contribute to observed individual differences in quantitative and qualitative intelligence. So how do these quote unquote smart brains differ? Um, I don't really love that title because I think that, yeah, um, it- that's just not a helpful term. But really, studies have shown that differences in intelligence are linked to structural and functional variations. Lateral prefrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior parietal cortex, and sensory areas in the occipital and temporal lobes show some of these variations. So, higher intelligence test performance is associated with increased activation in some regions and reduced activation in others. The parietal frontal network is what really forms the basis of intelligence as we understand it, and individual differences in intelligence tend to be related to the structural and functional differences in these regions. So there is this parietal frontal integration theory of intelligence, which really tries to argue exactly what I just said, that the differences in intelligence are linked to these structural and functional variations in these particular brain regions. There's been a modified PFIT model, which differentiates between functional, so the brain activation shown in an fMRI, and the structural, the amount of gray matter shown in an MRI, which then correlates with intelligence and identifies both positive and negative associations between intelligence and brain activity. A meta-analysis of structural MRIs that are shown in pink and fMRIs, which are shown in the gray yellow, collected during cognitive tasks, found clusters of regions showing positive or negative associations between intelligence and brain activation. Some of the differences in the PFIT model. So Eran Genick and colleagues, they combined a advanced diffusion tensor imaging method with a culturally neutral reasoning test. Now, this is something that they propose to be culturally neutral. I think it's also important to note that we should consider that with an asterisk. I think it's very difficult to truly make sure that we have culturally neutral tests because what does that functionally mean? How do we know that something is functionally neutral or not? But regardless, they're proposing that this is culturally neutral. And they found that specific microstructural properties are associated with intelligence, especially the cortical regions in the parietal frontal network. They posit that neurite density is negatively correlated with intelligence. Aaron Barbie found network neuroscience theory, and they proposed that different brain networks for crystallized intelligence, which is acquiring knowledge. That would be, again, knowledge, not like knowing that Lansing is the capital of Michigan. That would fall under some of the crystallized knowledge. And fluid intelligence, which is more of the problem-solving type of intelligence. That the two networks are considered segregated subsystems, and the resting brain shows a balanced state between integrated and segregated networks. And that's a lot of what the lecture is for this particular section on intelligence. I think a few things that I want to say, because I've thought about the concept of intelligence quite a bit. It was one of the major areas that got me interested in the field of psychology, I think, initially, and trying to understand it. A couple things. So one, I want to talk about kind of this idea of genius. And so the part of this lecture that we had in the beginning where we talked about Einstein's brain, I think what's really important for us to recognize about genius is that it's not just that we have this specific individual and they are just so unbelievably intelligent beyond any kind of comprehension. I think that they are incredibly intelligent. That's undoubtedly true. Somebody like Einstein truly is surely far, far more intelligent than I am, for example. But the fact that we consider Einstein a genius is partially the his intellectual ability, but it also was a product of the time in which he'd lived, and the type of knowledge and understanding that he had at that time, and the variables around that, which help him to rise to such prominence at that time where we think of him as a genius. Another individual who we will commonly talk about as a genius is somebody like Bill Gates, for example, and all of the work he did with Microsoft and bringing about the computer revolution that we've seen in the recent age. And what's so interesting is that, yes, I mean, surely he is, again, far more intelligent than I am. But growing up, he had access to go into computer labs and work on computer labs and computer coding at one of the few universities in the country that had that type of program available, as he grew up in California right by this university. And his school was connected to the after school program that allowed him to go to the university to get some of this experience. And I think his mom had these connections through the university as well. So he had the right type of knowledge at the right time historically for that knowledge to just pay off in huge dividends for him to be the household name that he is today. Part of that is surely a function of his intelligence and of his curiosity, but his specific interest in computers and computer programming as a young child, he likely didn't have the insight to recognize what a huge revolution this would be. Similarly, today, somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, who helped with the creation of Facebook and founded Facebook, and Meta now as an organization, he was really trying to create this social app to assist with, I think, dating initially. It was not intended to be this huge phenomena that it is today, that's really taken over human social behavior in the social world for uh, a lot of modern humanity. So it was the intelligence that the individual has, coupled with the timing and the experiences that he had access to, or the person has access to around that time. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about with intelligence is I think that discussions of intelligence are one of the more inflammatory topics in the field of psychology. A lot of people have really strong feelings about intelligence and how do we discuss it? And I think that's really understandable because humans think of ourselves as this particularly intelligent species compared to other species on the planet. We're kind of the crown jewel of intelligence on cognitive functioning on Earth. And as a result, I think that we have this consistent difficulty in comparing our intelligence with others, in trying to think of ourselves as being intelligent. And if we're struggling in some area, we consider that we make up for it in some other areas as well, and that surely that must be intelligence too. And I think that what becomes a barrier to our understanding of intelligence and intelligence research is the idea that a human's being's like worth and value is not innately tied to their intelligence. It is not tied to how well they can do things, how well they can complete tasks, not certainly not how well they score on a test of intelligence. A human being has worth because of the fact that they are a human being in and of themselves. And so I think when we're talking about intelligence and people have high intelligence or low intelligence or anything in between, um, I think that we shouldn't consider that as something that's substantially different than talking about somebody's height or weight or anything else. That those things essentially, like your IQ score, that's another number along with the other things. And does that provide some information? Sure, it provides information, but it doesn't actually impact, I think, the way that we think about and understand this person. And um, I think that that's a really important task to try to understand in this type of concept. Also, when we're thinking about the difference between like high intelligence and low intelligence and what some of that means. So some individuals who have particularly high intelligence, essentially what that means is if they're given a task, it will take them less time if they're putting forth effort to become proficient at that task compared to somebody with average or lower intelligence trying to complete the same task at the same time with the same baseline information. So it can help the person get there, but no matter what your level of intelligence is within some boundaries, people over time and with practice are able to become proficient in many of these different areas. And even if you have extremely high IQ intelligence, if you're not motivated and you're not putting in the effort to gain proficiency or to learn certain abilities, that's not going to end up causing any functional difference for you. And kind of the cultural archetype of this is The Simpsons has like comic book guy or whatever. And I think he has this just unbelievably high IQ, but his whole motivation, interest, and application of that intelligence is understanding comic books and its relation and to other comic book characters. And so he becomes really frustrated in society. It's because he has this high IQ, but it's being put towards concepts that are kind of not helpful to the rest of society. So I don't know. That's kind of a rant. I'll get off my soapbox now, but I think that understanding how we talk about intelligence research is just an important topic, especially for those of us in the field of psychology and understanding what that means and keeping it grounded in like a human-centric approach. But like I said, I'll step off my soapbox there and get into part 7 of our lecture. So this is going to be talking about why are we conscious? Conscious is another one of the major, just like philosophical questions in the field. So consciousness, this is the level of responsiveness of the mind to impressions made by the senses. Consciousness may provide an adaptive advantage in some way. So why would humans need consciousness? As an amount of information about an event increases, it becomes advantageous to produce a single complex representation that make it available for a sufficient time to the parts of the brain. And this is then consciousness. So there's an experiment, and the question is, can people alter their movements without conscious awareness? Volunteers were required to move their hands and grasp the illuminated rod as quickly as possible. In these trials, the volunteers reached for the illuminated rod, number 3 here. On some trials, the light jumps from one target to another, causing the volunteer to correct their trajectory. Most participants found that they were actually grasping the new target before they were aware that the light had jumped. Which then, I mean, it begs the question then, if their brain is making these movements, but they're not actually consciously aware of that change in behavior, well, what does that mean? Are we making movements without conscious awareness? What's doing that? Ginrod and colleagues, they found that dissociation between motor behaviors and conscious awareness, where again, these subjects made movements before they were aware of them. The conscious ventral stream is needed to discriminate among particular stimuli and respond differentially to them. Consciousness allows us to select behaviors that correspond to an understanding of the nuances of sensory inputs. What is the neural basis of consciousness? So there are some conditions in which people can process information without being aware of that information. So these are things we've talked about in some previous lectures, like blind sight, formagnosia, visual neglect, and amnesia. And in some conditions, people have conscious awareness of imaginary events, such as phantom limb syndrome or hallucinations in schizophrenia. Some of the conclusions we can draw from this is that the representation of a visual object is likely distributed over many brain parts, and part of this neural circuit must produce awareness. Neuroscience researchers hold that neural basis of consciousness has two distinct features. There is the level of consciousness, which is the arousal or wakefulness, which is related to the activity of ascending activating systems of the brainstem. And there's the content of consciousness, which is related to the connections between the thalamus and the cortex, or the thalamocortical system. Finally, Antonio Damasio has the evolutionary theory, which is that there's this interoceptive or internal state and the exteroceptive or external state. And the reward systems evolved to maximize incentives, as did an alerting system, the reticular activating system, to activate other systems. Mashore and colleagues, they offer the global neuronal workspace theory, in which consciousness is instantiated by amplifying information across an interconnected network of sensory cortical areas and prefrontal parietal networks. Bowley and others, they proposed the information integration theory. The IIT proposes that consciousness reflects an amount of maximally irreducible integrated information generated by regions of the posterior cortex and is generated by the cortical sensory modules. So, if you haven't guessed it already, based on these couple of slides talking about some of the theories, the question of consciousness is a huge area of philosophical discussion in the field of psychology and neuroscience and philosophy. I had actually taken an entire course in undergraduate about the theory of mind and understanding what is consciousness as a part of it and some of the philosophical questions in understanding this. So this is a really, really interesting area to try to understand. I'm sorry that I'm not able to offer more question or more answers than I am. There are researchers who are trying to understand this a little bit more, but there's still so much yet to learn. So I hope this has sparked your interest and you've become interested in learning a little bit more. If you'd like some book recommendations, anything like that, feel free to send me an email and I'd be happy to try to provide that for you as well. And that is the last slide of our last lecture. Thank you everybody so much for all of your hard work throughout the semester. I know there's a lot of information that happens in this course. I appreciate you being so diligent in your time and efforts to complete this. And I wish you all the best of luck in the final exam and going forward. Bye-bye.